welcome back to our channel. So in today's session we'll discuss about one more topic in DBMS, that is properties of a functional dependency. Properties of functional dependency. So actually in the previous session we have discussed about this functional dependency, what exactly this functional dependency is, and the anomalies which we have covered in the previous session. So here we will go with the properties of functional dependency, and these properties are also known as ARMSTRONG axioms. ARMSTRONG axioms, right? So the first property, so we know that the functional dependency is denoted as some x tends to y. Here x will be considered as a determinant and y is a dependent, and this we call it as y is functionally dependent on x, or x determines the y. And we call it as a functional dependency if satisfies one constraint, that consider two random tuples so that the x value of both the tuples are equal, then the y value of corresponding tuple should also be equal. So if this constraint is satisfied, then only we are saying that this is a functionally dependent, right? So this is all about our functional dependency. Now the property, the first property is reflexivity. Reflexivity. So this reflexivity property means if A is a set of attributes, A is a set of attributes and B is subset of A, then A tends to B is a functionally dependent. So this is the first property, or we can call it as a first ARMSTRONG axiom, that is the dependent is a subset of determinant. Dependent, so this implies a dependent is a subset of determinant. So then we call this property as a reflexivity property, right? The second one, augmentation. So second one is the augmentation. So this augmentation property, so if A tends to B is functionally dependent, then if we add some attributes, if you add a single attribute or a set of attributes on both the determinant and the dependent, then also it will be the functionally dependent. So then, if C is attribute or set of attributes added to both determinant and dependent. So simply we can call it as a LHS and RHS. Okay, LHS and RHS. Then AC tends to CD is also functionally dependent. It's also functionally dependent. So adding the attributes to both the dependent and the determinant will also be the functionally dependent. So this type of property or axiom we call as augmentation property or augmentation ARMSTRONG axiom. So hope you understood the first two, reflexivity and the this augmentation. The third one is a transitivity. See, third one, transitivity. So if A tends to B is functionally dependent and B tends to C is also functionally dependent, then the transitivity rule says that A tends to C is also functionally dependent. So this is called transitivity rule, right? If A tends to B is a functionally dependent and B tends to C is also functionally dependent, that implies we can get B if you know A, and if you get C if you know B. So obviously you can get a C if you know A. So that is called the transitivity axiom or transitivity property. So the three Armstrong axioms of functional dependencies are: one is a reflexivity, another one is augmentation, and the next one is transitivity. So these three are the Armstrong axioms. And apart from these Armstrong axioms, we are also having some rules, inference rules, right? So which are derived from these Armstrong axioms. So let us check these inference rules which are derived from the Armstrong axioms. So inference rules, and also we can call it as a secondary rules. Secondary rules. So these are derived from these Armstrong axioms. Okay, these are derived from the Armstrong axioms. The first rule is a union. So if A tends to B is a functionally dependent and A tends to C is also a functionally dependent, then A tends to BC is also functionally dependent. So this type of rule we call it as a union. So if A tends to B, A tends to C, simply we can combine this. If you know A, we can get B. If you know A, we can get C. So if you know A, we can get a B and C. So you no need to write a two dependencies, right? So we can combine that. So this type of property we call it as a union property or union rule. The next one, second one, composition. So what is this, a composition, right? So if A tends to B is a functionally dependency and C tends to D is also a functionally dependency, then combining both the dependents and combining both the determinants. So AC tends to BD is also functionally dependent, right? So combining both the determinants and both the dependents. If you know A and C, we can get the values B and T, right? So this type of thing we call it as a composition. This type of property or rules we call it as a composition, right? Hope you understood this one. Next, the third one is a decomposition. Decomposition. So what is this decomposition? So if A tends to B and C, okay, that means is a functional dependent. So if you know A, we can get B and C. So this can be divided. This can be divided. A tends to B and A tends to C. So both are functionally dependent. So this is called a decomposition. That means a dividing the functional dependency. So we are dividing this functional dependency. So A tends to B is a functionally dependent and A tends to C is also a functionally dependent. So such type of rule we call it as a decomposition. And the next one, the last one, is a pseudo-transitivity. Pseudo-transitivity. So here the transitivity rule we have seen in the previous just now, that is if A tends to B and B tends to C, so simply we can say A tends to C. So this is a transitive. So here the pseudo-transitivity says if A tends to B and BC tends to D, so is an functionally dependent, and is here also it is a functionally dependent. So then we can say that AC tends to D is also functionally dependent, which is similar to our transitivity rule. So this called as a pseudo-transitivity. So if A tends to B is a functionally dependent and BC tends to D is a functionally dependent, so simply AC tends to D will also be the functionally dependent. So this type of thing we call it as a pseudo-transitivity. So there are 4 rules called as a inference rules, or we can call them as a secondary rules. So the first one, union, composition, decomposition, pseudo-transitivity. So these 4 are the inference rules which are derived from the axioms. Right? So hope you understood these properties of functional dependencies, and also we call it as Armstrong axioms. Right? So if you are having any doubts regarding this session, feel free to post your doubts in the comment section. I definitely will try to clarify all your doubts. And if you really enjoyed my session, like my session, share my session with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. Thank you very much.